I'm glad your appetite is whetted because you have to wait just a little bit longer because there's some background that I want to give you about the Jerusalem Decree and the Jerusalem Council. This is a debate that's often been held, and my previous discussion was presupposing my conclusion of this debate. But the debate is whether the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15 is the same time as Galatians chapter 2, or some people think it's the same as Galatians chapter 1. Here are some of the different views. Galatians 2, 1 through 10, instead of that being Acts 15, it's when Paul and Barnabas took the collection from Antioch to Jerusalem in Acts 11:30 and 12:25. It's held by William Ramsey and is held by many evangelical scholars and some other scholars today. Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, being the same as Acts 15, was held by J.B. Lightfoot, who was a 19th century evangelical scholar, and by many scholars today, including myself, a number of evangelical scholars, although not perhaps as many as the other view, and a number of other scholars as well. Perhaps the majority of scholars, but there's some debate. Galatians 2, 1 through 10 is both of them with two different sources recounting it differently. That's not my view. I'm just giving you views. Some say, well, we don't care about Acts at all, and so Galatians chapter 2 doesn't have anything to do with any of them. And then some say it's Acts 15 plus some added elements, perhaps from Acts 11 or somewhere else. Here are the arguments favoring it being the famine visit of Acts 11:30. I'm going to give you those arguments and then give you the reasons why I'm not persuaded by them. You're, of course, free to hold your own view. Paul would not have omitted the famine visit, they said, in Galatians. Well, there's no reason to mention it in Galatians. After all, he's emphasizing his independence from the apostles. They may have been in hiding at that point, if it's chronologically the same as in Acts. And if it was delivered to the elders, there's no reason to mention it. Well, they say, well, why not mention the decree if the decree had already happened by the time that Galatians was written? Well, regardless of when you date Galatians, it's also not mentioned in 1 Corinthians and Romans, which surely come after the decree of the council was made. Also, Acts specifies the range of the decree. It's to Syria and Cilicia. It didn't go as far as Galatia. When the decree was made, it wasn't an issue yet in Galatia. The further you go from Jerusalem, also, the more the appeal to first principles was valuable rather than an appeal to centralized authority. Well, some say there's too many discrepancies if you identify this not with the famine visit, but with Acts 15. Well, it's even worse. You have more discrepancies if you identify it with the famine visit. You know, the comments about the famine visit in Acts are so brief that you can make comparisons only from silence. There's nothing in common with the famine visit and Galatians 2, except that both Barnabas and Saul are present, which is also true in Acts chapter 15. Further, why in Galatians 2 would they ask them to remember the poor during a famine visit, when exactly that's what they were doing, was remembering the poor? Yet Galatians 2:10 says they were asked to remember that. Well, some have argued, and I think this is a reasonable argument, and I'm not saying this position is not a reasonable position. In fact, probably most of my friends hold it. But anyway, Revelation in Galatians 2:2, they've identified that with the prophecy in Acts 11:28-30. But if you look in the context in Galatians, the phrasing of revelation or revealing in Galatians 1:12 and 16 refers to Paul's own encounter with Christ. And so when he's speaking of going up because of a revelation in Galatians 2:2, he's probably speaking of the gospel that was revealed to him, that he's defending in Galatians 2:1 through 10. Another argument that's been made for Galatians 2, identified with the famine visit, is that it allows for an earlier date of Galatians. Well, the problem is it sounds more like it's from the period in Paul's life as Romans, although somewhat earlier than Romans, not the same period as 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So if you're trying to do it based on date, actually it might be easier to argue the other way. In Acts chapter 15, the conflict had just reached Antioch in Syria. It hadn't yet reached Galatia, and that's why the decree is only addressed to Syria and Cilicia and not to Galatia. A sixth argument. They say, well, maybe Acts 15, which talks about circumcision and so on, revisits an earlier subject that was raised during the famine visit. In logic, you have something called Occam's razor, where the simplest solution tends to be the best. The simplest solution is that Galatians 2 and Acts 15, which address the same topic, are the same visit, rather than saying, well, maybe this topic was broached in the famine visit earlier, where it's not mentioned, and that's why it's mentioned later on. Here are some arguments, besides the arguments I've been giving against the famine visit view, here are some arguments for why it represents Acts 15. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 is the same as Galatians 2, 1 through 10. First of all, Titus is mentioned, Galatians 2, 1 through 3. Paul mentions him as known to the Galatians. Probably Titus was a Galatian. If not, he was probably with Paul on his visit there, but probably he was a Galatian. Acts 11 and 12 took place before Paul's missionary journeys, so the famine visit would have been before Titus's conversion, if he was a Galatian. Acts 13 and 14 was that first, what's often called a missionary journey. Titus was therefore probably not yet converted when the famine visit took place, but he was surely converted after, by the time you go through the ministry in Galatians 13 and 14, he was surely converted by Acts 15. Also, there are a number of commonalities between Acts 15 and Galatians 2. Both councils, so to speak, have the same basic object. Both have the same basic outcome. Paul's mission is recognized in both. The leaders agree in both that Gentiles need not be circumcised. Peter was involved, and James was involved. And as mentioned before, of course, Paul and Barnabas were involved, just as they were in the famine visit. Granted, there are some omissions, but you can't argue from silence. I mean, Luke is not bound to mention everything Paul mentions, or vice versa. Luke knows Paul's collection. He mentions it in 24:17, but almost completely omits it as not relevant to his account, because it's not his point. It's not what he's going to be stressing. We could talk about why that is. Personally, I think it's probably because it didn't achieve all that Paul was hoping that it might achieve, namely the reconciliation of Jewish and Gentile churches, or perhaps because it was just a non-issue by the time that Luke was writing. So many other things had happened that were more significant. Maybe the Jerusalem church itself was not so much of an issue at that point. But anyway, Luke knows Paul's collection, but he almost completely omits it as not relevant to his story. Joseph Fitzmyer, a leading commentator on Acts, points out that none of the differences is, quote, significant enough to undermine the substantial agreement of the two reports. So what this gives us then is multiple attestation to the Jerusalem Council that answers those who think that Acts 15 is Luke's fiction to make it look like the church could get along. Well, actually, they did come to a kind of consensus in Galatians chapter 2, even though it had to be revisited under unfortunate circumstances when Peter visited Antioch in 2:11 through 14 of Galatians.